Hello everyone, today we're going to go over this tutorial for a dip powder manicure for beginners. Before you dip, make sure that you're adequately prepping your nail, including filing your nail to your desired shape, removing and pushing back your cuticles, as well as using a cuticle nipper to remove any dead skin or hangnails if necessary. To ensure a long-lasting manicure, use a generous coat of pH prep to make sure that the nail is dehydrated prior to dipping. Once the pH prep is dried, you can go in with your first coat of base bond. I recommend doing a thin strip down the center of the nail so that we can build up the dip powder and make sure it doesn't get too thick at the cuticle line. Make sure when you're dipping your finger into the powder, you dip at a 45-degree angle so as to prevent any pooling at the tip of the nail. I also recommend using your finger to tap off the excess powder instead of tapping it off on the jar so that the jar doesn't spill. After your first coat of dip powder is dry, which usually only takes a minute or so, use a fluffy brush to brush off any excess dip powder prior to going in with your second coat. Once again, use the base bond to create the second coat of dip powder. I recommend working a little bit closer to the cuticle line, not quite all the way to it, but also staying away from the sidewalls for the second coat. Be sure you wipe off your base bond brush before it goes back in the bottle to prevent any contamination from the dip powder. Once again, before the third dip, make sure you use a fluffy brush to brush off any excess dip powder, and then go in with your third coat of base bond. This time we're going to work all the way to the cuticle line and across the sidewalls, dipping the entire nail into the dip powder. I recommend taking a little bit of extra time during this step and being very deliberate with where you put your base bond to ensure you get a nice, clean, professional looking manicure. Once you're done tapping off the excess dip powder, take a toothpick or an orange stick and drag it along the edges of the dip powder. This way you'll get a nice clean cuticle line every time. After dusting off the excess dip powder, you may decide that you need a fourth or even a fifth dip to make sure that the cuticle line and the sidewalls are completely opaque. If you're going to do this, just follow the exact same process that you did in the previous step. Keep in mind that if you're working with a particularly dark, pigmented, or a glitter dip, it's recommended that you do a dip of clear over any of these products to make sure that you get a nice smooth finish at the end and that it's protected from buffing. Once you've dusted off the excess dip powder the final time, use a generous coat of Solidify over the entire nail and wait a couple of minutes for it to dry. Once the Solidify is dry, go ahead in shaping the nail again from both the top as well as the sides if it's necessary for your shape. And then use either a buffing block or a hand file to get the surface of the nail completely smooth prior to moving on to the next step. After you're done washing your hands, use a second coat of Solidify, this time using only enough to cover the nail in 3 or 4 quick strokes. Once you've given the second coat of Solidify a couple to a few minutes to dry, use a lint-free paper towel or cloth to wipe off any excess, and then you can start your first coat of Glossy. I recommend doing the first coat of Glossy in 3 quick strokes using as little pressure as possible. Also make sure you're wiping off your Glossy coat brush prior to putting it back in the bottle to prevent any contamination. After approximately 1 to 2 minutes, your first coat of Glossy coat should be dry and you can start with the second. Again, I recommend that you keep it to 3 or 4 quick strokes so as not to cause any unnecessary streaks. Once your second coat of Glossy Coat is dry, which should only take a couple of minutes, make sure you rehydrate your cuticles with some cuticle oil and you're all finished. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope you found it helpful. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, and happy dipping!